Donald Trump's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, was asked at her Monday press briefing by reporters whether Donald Trump plans to resume the coronavirus press briefings. And she didn't answer the question, but the answer is obviously no. And it's a good question to ask because we're seeing massive coronavirus hotspots growing very rapidly in the United States, mostly different areas than the early hotspots. And I'm going to talk about the virus itself shortly. But there's a real media story here to understand. We talk about the bully pulpit of corporate media. Much of what is in the national discussion, the top three stories that are in the national discussion at any given time, are essentially led by corporate media. And this is called agenda setting power. It's not necessarily that corporate media tells us what to think about any particular issue, although sometimes they do, but it's that corporate media tells us what to think about, what to talk about. And I'll give you an example. Remember Kids in Cages, the immigration scandal? It's still going on, but it's rarely, if ever, in the media, except to mention that some people being held at the border have contracted coronavirus. But nothing has fundamentally changed about that story, which was wall-to-wall coverage previously during this administration. Now it's like it doesn't exist. Then it was coronavirus. We have a pandemic, daily press briefings, including Donald Trump and doctors Fauci and Birx, daily updates down to the specific details about the number of masks and Project Airbridge flights from Mike Pence. And then the White House signaled we're going to stop. Trump wondered aloud about injecting bleach and isopropyl alcohol to treat coronavirus. It became clear that the White House didn't really want more visibility for doctors Birx and Fauci talking about the virus. So the briefing stopped. And with that, over time, as more and more states have decided to reopen, some are safely reopening, some are very unsafely reopening, the topic of the virus itself started to take a backseat, especially as the George Floyd killing took place and the massive protests started. And now, as we're seeing, the protests are starting to die down a little bit, but the big topic has become defund the police or do not defund the police, depending on whose perspective you're listening to. Right-wing media saying defunding the police would be anarchy. Some on the left furious that Biden does not want to defund the police, but understand that nothing materially has changed with coronavirus. We'll look at the data, put it up on the screen. Now, fortunately, as you can see, we've seen a leveling off and a slow decline in the number of cases at the national level. But mostly what we're seeing is the cases being relocated where we are finding new hotspots. Understand that at the peak, we were finding 25 to 30,000 cases a day. We are still finding 19 to 25,000 new cases every single day. And the number of active cases, meaning people who currently have the virus, is still as high as it's ever been. And yet Donald Trump barely talks about coronavirus. His press secretary barely talks about coronavirus. Right-wing media is done with it, other than calling it a scam or a conspiracy. And even corporate media is increasingly talking about coronavirus less and less. But we have a new Politico article that points out not only is the pandemic still very much a pandemic with no effective treatment, no vaccine, we have new hotspots that are setting records for new cases. There are parts of the country that are exploding with virus cases. And Donald Trump is just silent. Another massive failure because Trump, by not talking about it, makes people think the threat is over, meaning they go out and behave irresponsibly and cause even more cases. And in fact, as we talked about yesterday on the bonus show, Donald Trump is planning to restart his huge MAGA rallies as part of his 2020 reelection campaign in a couple of weeks. So I'll give you some really specific examples. Texas, which started to reopen pretty quickly, is exploding. Week to week, they have more and more cases. The number of active cases in Texas is higher today than it has ever been. Florida, run by Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, also started to open pretty early. They were caught lying about numbers, as we previously covered. And after a small dip sometime in April, which might have just been them lying, they once again in Florida are seeing record numbers of new cases. Now, I mentioned that the cases are dramatically shifting from some parts of the country to others. This doesn't mean, things aren't going terribly everywhere. I am thrilled to say that here in Massachusetts, at least for now, cases have been very steadily declining since late April. The graph I'm showing you, you'll see a 1-day spike about a week ago. That's not really a spike. That was a bunch of presumptive cases from the 3 months of coronavirus were all added in on that day. But we are looking really good here, and I'm thrilled to see that. So this is a story not just about the virus itself, which is still raging with no treatment or vaccine, but it's a media story as well about the agenda setting power that corporate media has. We said 7 weeks ago, Trump's strategy is going to be just start pretending it doesn't exist, start talking about the economy, jobs, reopening, and a bunch of corporate media has played along. Now, in the meantime, things are so bad here in the United States with coronavirus that as more and more countries are reopening travel, the United States is being banned. I'll give you an example. Iceland has so dominated the virus that Iceland decided that on, I believe it's June 15th, they're going to reopen tourism. When you get to Iceland, you have to have a COVID test at the airport or quarantine for 14 days. People are going to be able to go to Iceland and start doing tourism if that's what they want to do, except Americans aren't going to be allowed because things are so out of control here. Other countries, people are going to be allowed to start going to Iceland, not Americans, because it's a disaster. And I wouldn't be surprised if this continues. As the virus keeps spreading in different U.S. states, other countries are going to be increasingly controlling it. Not Brazil, India, there's places that Russia that aren't controlling it, but more and more countries are going to be allowed to restart travel. And Americans are going to be banned from going to other countries because it is so poorly handled here. Now, as far as the framing and the propaganda, expect Trump soon to start arguing that Antifa and other left-wing protesters are responsible for spreading the virus. If the numbers keep growing in a lot of these new hotspots like Florida and Texas, I would anticipate that Donald Trump will take the protests as the perfect opportunity to say it's Antifa and lefties that are now responsible, if he even mentions it at all. And to be clear, the protests will cause some number of new cases. What we're seeing now is reflective of the situation 10 to 14 days ago. And that's important to remember. Be ready for it because it's going to happen. And don't forget, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, which some doctors believe is still in its beginning phases, which is overwhelming to think about. Our sponsor, NordVPN, is giving you 70% off a 3-year plan, which is just a little over $3 a month. And you will get an extra month free when you go to nordvpn.com/David Pakman, or just go to their website and use the coupon code David Pakman. By this point in time, if you're not using a VPN when you're on the internet, you are putting yourself at a huge disadvantage. NordVPN keeps your IP address hidden when you're browsing online, keeps your personal data safe from hackers, prevents websites from following you around the internet, and you can even use it on your phone. There are many different VPN options out there, but NordVPN is the one I trust because they don't log your internet history. They use military-grade encryption, and they encrypt your data twice to double the anonymity. NordVPN is giving you 70% off a 3-year plan. That's just over $3 a month, plus an extra month free when you go to nordvpn.com/David Pakman. I've put a link right underneath the video, or just go to their website and use the coupon code David Pakman.